Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a metaphor for this show is if you're going down a highway and you see an interesting turn to the right, but you're not really sure where that's going to go, you take that turn and then you find yourself in the middle of a mystery. Well, we're going to take that kind of turn today. We're going to go clear across the pond to England and we're going to have a conversation with Russell Edwards. And the reason Russell is interesting to have a conversation with is he's into Jack the Ripper. And as somebody who used to teach criminology, I've had kind of a fascination with serial killers in the past. And we did a show on the Zodiac murders here in the United States, but I think the Ripper murders uh, has some parallels to the Zodiac murders. And what better way to delve into that mystery than to talk to somebody who's studied it. So welcome to our show, Russell.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, anytime. Tell me how you became interested in, I guess the term would be ripperology.
Yeah, I've been in the area, believe it or not, in East End since 1989 till the film From Hell. So it's sort of like 2001.
Uh-huh.
Over 11 years, I've been literally every weekend in Brick Lane, visiting all the pubs, the curry houses, which I really love. And it wasn't until I watched the film From Hell, when I asked the same question, probably millions of people have. The 10 Bells, who's Jack the Ripper? What's this story? Is it real? So after watching the film, literally on the day of the release, the very next day I went on a Ripper tour.
Mm.
Uh, and then I realized, wow, this is exactly the area where I've been for 11 years and really didn't have any involvement or interest, that much interest, in the story itself. So being singularly minded is the best way I can put it.
Mm.
I called Scotland Yard on the Monday and asked them how real was the case and where can I find the case evidence. And luckily enough, because it was the 1888 to 1988, it's like a 100-year rule of where the files are closed. But by the time I called, everything was open, so it was very easy to access. So my journey from I would say a businessman to solving who Jack the Ripper was using DNA all stemmed from watching the film From Hell.
And that's with Johnny Depp, as I recall. I think I've
Yeah,
seen that film as well. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
And what were you doing prior to becoming a Ripper enthusiast? You're a businessman. What type of
It,
business were you in?
yeah. Interesting Ripper enthusiast. Really, that part of my life was over very quickly because when I did the research, I realized very quickly that you really could not name who the Ripper was because it's all conjecture and fantasy is the best word I can put it. So before I did this, I was a professional businessman. I had care homes, so I used to look after the elderly. I've been in property development for years before that, about 25 years. So I used to have 155 staff all working for
Wow.
me. Yeah, traveling across the country nearly every other day. So I'm really, we just finished renovating a very large house as well. So it's a very large house, sort of like 9 bedrooms or 8 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, four massive living rooms, and so on and so on. So my life was very busy, as it always has been. But at that part of my life, it was more to do with business ventures, investments, land investments. So really, this quirky little interest was no more at the time, no more than a hobby, really.
Did some of the people around you going, "What the hell's wrong with you, Russell?
It
Leaving
it
business?"
it,
Yeah.
it
What
was
was the reaction?
it was really strange because the Ten Bells pub, I just bought a care home, and the Ten Bells pub came up for sale, and
Oh,
if, and literally at that time, I could have bought the Ten Bells pub instead of the care home, but I sunk all my money in the care home at the time. In a way, I'm glad I did. And the people really, the only thing that was interesting was when people said, "Oh, Jack the Ripper." it was a case of, well, we would just, my friends, we would just go for a curry, which I'm a big fan of, definitely down Brick Lane. And then we would just go and obviously just go and walk around the area because it is quite haunting. But that's as much as it was for a good few years until the shore came across. It came across the shore.
Take us back to 1888 and Whitechapel. What was that area like at that time?
Yeah, that was a very impoverished area. Um, it's interesting on my Facebook page. People are shocked when they see the Bangladeshi community today, when actually all that time the East End has always been an area of mass immigration.
Hmm.
So the 18th century it was the French Huguenots. The 19th century, the Jewish community, I would say, flooded. 28,000 Jewish immigrants came in, fled in the Russian pogroms in the 1881 in that area. And then in about the 1970s, 1960s, the Bangladeshi community came in. But around the time of 1888, this area was really a violent, I would say, virulent area. This is not a pleasant area to be. This is where the poorest of poor, literally thieves, you would be robbed of your money, you'd be, attacked. And over the years, there's been a few great depictions of the area at the time. The way that Sherlock Holmes has been done with Robert Downey Jr. There's
Okay.
a great film. Dorian Gray was another one, very good. But really, it's just to try and capture a moment in time that really is romanticized for many and everybody. So many people come on my page saying they love the Victorian era, but this part of London was more, I would say, not a very pleasant area to be at that time in 1888. So there were about 63 or 68 registered brothels and
Hmm.
up to about 1,200 prostitutes in the area. So I would say the tops or the gentlemen of the time of London would visit that area for cheap alcohol, drugs. Drugs was rife at the time. So laudanum, opium. There were lots of opium dens, definitely down in Chinatown, which is down Limehouse. And then, believe it or not, arsenic was used as a recreational drug back then.
Really,
And yeah,
arsenic.
arsenic, yeah. And there was like people dying and getting prosecuted for murder when actually the Francis Maybrick, Florence Maybrick is a good one. And James Maybrick, who definitely wasn't the Ripper, she was prosecuted for his murder. And it turned out he'd taken an overdose of arsenic and died
Arsenic.
of
Hmm.
you know. So yeah, it was a rough area, and not just that. Right in the middle, or at the height of it, the Ripper struck over a 10-week period, right in the middle, and butchered at least 5 women.
Yeah, it seems like there's like the Zodiac killer. There's kind of some conjecture about how many victims there were. So, five
That's,
people definitely been tied to the Ripper. Is there speculation about maybe committed more?
that, interestingly enough, you've sort of touched on a nerve with the Zodiac because we're actually actively investigating the Zodiac case right now.
Really?
Um, yeah, right now, yeah. In fact, I would say my confidant all the way through this is Dr. Yori Lohalainen, a gifted scientist to say the least. Comes up with I would say with results and scientific work that's used across Europe, that other scientists just can't do. So he's a very gifted, unique scientist, and I found a way in to the Zodiac case that people have missed, the same way that I found a way into the Ripper case that people have missed.
Hmm. And that would be of really interesting to me because uh, I have a friend here in the States, Drew Beeson, and he wrote a book about the Zodiac. You might want to go on our YouTube channel and watch the interview I did with him, and that would give you
Yeah,
least some of the background that he was talking about. So let's come back to the Zodiac in a bit. Let's go down
Yeah.
the Ripper rabbit hole, and then we'll come back to the Zodiac. So identify who the five victims that they've definitely been able to tie to Jack the Ripper were all prostitutes, correct?
Um, Great question, and this always causes contention. So the word prostitute is, obviously a woman that goes out to sell her body for money. These women were deemed unfortunates, so they would try to get domestic servant work, cleaning work, any day-to-day work to help with their existence. To say, if they couldn't find their DOS money, so their bed for the night money, which is only 4 pennies, they were forced really to sell their bodies. So this is one thing I'm very passionate about. I've been doing this now for 24 years, and I can tell you, really, these women were destitute, really, living a very lowly life and just really trying to get from day to day. So unfortunate is the better term, but there were five, and they're called the canonical five. So in the group, and that is Mary Ann or Polly Nichols, that lost her life on the 31st of August, 1888.
And how old was she at the time of death?
Oh, in the 40s. They, except for the last victim, Mary Jane Kelly, they were all in the 40s and early 40s. And again, if we look at our generation now and future generations, the 40s is really an age for us that's sort of middle-aged. Back then, you weren't expected to live, to these ripe old ages that we do nowadays. So they were sort of on the twilight of the years, if you like. Polly, again, had fallen foul of alcohol. By the way, I just want to add that I specialise in alcohol addiction, so I'm a psychotherapist as well. So I treat for addiction. So she fell foul of alcohol and was forced on that night to try and find the DOS money, because she was kicked out of a lodging house or a DOS house because she didn't have 4 pennies for a bed. If she did, she wouldn't have been the acknowledged first victim. That's interesting how these are termed the victims of the Ripper, or the murderer known as the Ripper. It was because of the way that they were murdered in a specific way, the way that they were laid out in a specific way. So very ritualistic in the murders. So it's Mary Ann or Polly Nichols. Then there was Annie Chapman, also known as Dark Annie. She was discovered in the backyard of Hanbury Street on the 29th, no, she wasn't, the 8th of September, 1888 at number 29 Hanbury Street. Now, the reason why she was discovered there was because the double doors are on 29 Hanbury Street. One door led through the hallway into the backyard that was always on the latch, so it's never locked. So the unfortunates would take their customers into the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, service them, and then come back out through the front door, through the hallway. Interesting enough, there were about 16 people living at the time, and no one heard a thing.
No one heard anything. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Except for the neighbour, Albert Kadosh, at number 27, who apparently went out to relieve himself against the fence, and he heard the thud against the fence of 29, and he may have heard the murder of Annie Chapman as it happened. Didn't look over the fence, and it wasn't very high. So that's a sort of another. All of these are like mysteries wrapped up in an enigma always. And this is one of the reasons when I studied the case in the archives, I realised, that this is just, you're not onto a winner. So then, excuse me, we come to the 29th of September, 1888. So this is the night. So he went out and murdered on the night that sort of went into the next day, into the 30th. It's interesting, if you look this up, it says the 30th of September, but the actual case notes actually record it as the 29th of September. So the first victim on the 29th was Elizabeth Stride, who was Swedish. I think she's about 44. She also helped clean the DOS house where she stayed. But that night, for some reason, she went out and tried to earn herself some extra money. And she was discovered in Duffield Yard about 1 o'clock by a Jewish market traders, probably the best way to put it, called Louis Deemschutz. And then with this one, the atrocities that were inflicted on Elizabeth weren't as bad because the murder was interrupted. So he went out and found another victim who was discovered 45 minutes after the body of Elizabeth Stride. So this is known as the night of the double event. And the fourth murder victim, which really brings in my story, is Catherine Eddowes, who was born up in Wolverhampton in 19th of April 1944. 1844, sorry, I was getting mixed up.
Yeah.
1844. So she was just, she was just 43, 44 years of age. She'd had no money. They'd had a really, her and a partner, John Kelly, had been hop picking in Kent, very far, about 25 miles away. Very poor season, which is a lot of what a lot of EastEnders used to do, go hop picking in Gravesend, well, up in Kent. But they had no money, so her partner had to pawn his boots the day before. So she stayed at Cooney's Lodge. It's called Cooney's Lodging House. Very rough, a rough dive is the best way to put it. He stayed somewhere else. And then on the morning, that's the last time we saw her alive. So Catherine Eddowes is the one I would say, closest to me because of the research I've done on the case. And then from there, a 5-week break, which is the thing that I personally discovered that nobody else did, which was the way into the case. And then there was Mary Jane Kelly, who was 25, from Limerick in Ireland. And the main reason why she was a murder victim was because she didn't DOS like the other four. She had her own room in 13 Miller's Court. And her body was discovered on the morning of the 9th of November, 1888. And with most serial killers, I'm sure you've done this and you know yourself, they intensify with what they do. And by the time it got to Mary Jane Kelly, it was a crescendo of just the. I've seen. I like yourself. I study serial killers, not as intensely as the Ripper, but certainly know my onions on them. Still, Mary Jane Kelly's picture is still the worst picture I've ever seen. And I've seen Dharma's pictures, but Mary Jane Kelly is very much the worst one I've ever seen.
So if you could, Russell, describe to me some of the wounds, because the wounds might be a key as to who the person that perpetrated the crime would be.
Yeah, well, anatomical knowledge is definitely up there, even though it was contested. So all 5 had their throats cut. Polly had it down to a spinal cord, so did Annie Chapman. He did try and cut a head off, Annie Chapman. With Polly, her bowels were protruding, so he did try to disembowel her. With Annie Chapman, he did. These are. I never really go into the murders, but what I can tell you is they were disemboweled. Certain body parts, the uterus was taken from Annie, and part of her abdomen was taken. Elizabeth Stride had her throat cut and no other afflictions is probably the best word I can use here. Catherine Eddowes, he really vented his wrath that night because he'd been interrupted. She was facially mutilated. He did take her kidney and her uterus. He did disembowel her. He did certain ritualistic things to her. And then Mary Jane Kelly there was not much left. More like that's the best. Not much
So,
left.
Russell, when you say ritualistic things, what kind of things are we talking about?
So the way that the bodies were laid out, so heads to the left, arms out, one across the body, legs spread apart with the feet sort of turned inwards. He placed body parts for Mary Jane Kelly's between her feet, which was a liver. With Catherine Eddowes, it was a breast. He took a breast out and put a breast between her feet. Even though Elizabeth Stride was laid out in that way, he didn't have chance or time. Annie Chapman was laid out that way as well. and Polly Nichols was laid out in a specific way. So it was sort of, this is very much the way that he dressed, I think, or he dressed the scene. Excuse me. Now this is interesting because, like you say about the victims, there was a victim 3 weeks before Polly, so on the 7th of August, 1888, called Martha Tabram. Now, she'd been stabbed 39 times, again, genitalia, again, throat, and she was 39 years of age. Now, when you look at the press reports, if you study the press reports, which you can, you'll see that there wasn't much of a sensational sensation, if you like, because we knew Whitechapel and Spitalfields was a very violent area, so people just thought, well, that was just a woman being murdered.
Yeah, that's what happens in that area.
Yeah, exactly. So by the time he got to the Polly and the other 4, he sort of made it his own, if you like, because there were other murders. There were 11 murders in total, 5 attributed to him. But I always think with the cruelty of being stabbed 39 times, that might have been a fledgling killer's first go. So I always think that Martha Tabram was possibly most likely one of his victims.
It seems to me that, and this is just stuff I recall reading, and you would be more authoritarian about it than I would. But one of the victims had a kidney removed. I think you referred to that, and that kidney might have even been sent to the press in a letter. Is that accurate?
Nearly, you're nearly there. Yeah, it's so interestingly enough, when we get to the shore, we did find a kidney cell on the shore. It was the head of the Vigilance Committee, a guy called George Lusk, who on the 16th of October 1888 received a letter. And again, this letter is the only one that wasn't signed Jack the Ripper, and the one, in my opinion, should warrant for a lot further attention. But with that letter came a box containing half a kidney. That was sent to Dr. Openshaw over at the Royal Hospital over in Whitechapel, same place where Joseph Merrick lived, the Elephant Man.
Oh, the Elephant Man, huh?
Yeah, that's where he was. Yeah, in fact, yeah, that's another story. But yeah, he lived opposite, believe it or not. What I can say is that Catherine Eddowes suffered with Bright's disease, which is, a disease of the kidneys. We knew that these victims, a couple of them weren't going to live much longer anyway. Well, I say anyway, they should never have died the way that they did. But the kidney that was sent to George Lux, they say that also had Bright's disease. And there's a big interest to say that could have most possibly have been the other half of Catherine Eddowes' kidney.
Right. But that was sent in as part of some correspondence.
Well, it was sent as a letter. Yeah, it was sent as a letter to what was called the Vigilance Committee. So that was builders, shopkeepers, men that not gang together, that formed a group of concerned citizens that patrolled the street to keep the women safe.
So it wasn't the law enforcement people, the regular, like Scotland Yard, or I don't even know if Scotland Yard existed at that time.
Oh, Scotland Yard did, yeah. Scotland Yard was bombed by the Fenians, or the early IRA, back in 1884. So yeah, Scotland Yard was very much there, yeah.
But the correspondence didn't go to Scotland Yard; it went to the Citizens Committee.
That's right. And so the obvious interesting thing is that if that was written by the murderer known as the Ripper, then he knew of the Vigilance Committee and he knew of George Lusk. And when we actually get to who he was, there could have been a possibility he would have been a member
of that committee.
Yeah.
Well, so he wasn't, unlike the Zodiac killer who was corresponding with the media, writing into the San Francisco papers. The Ripper was not corresponding with the media. Would that be accurate?
That's completely accurate. All the letters were fake. There's a couple of letters they thought that warranted interest, but they were not real.
Seems
Oh,
to me I read something that there was even speculation that some of the media people were actually forging the letters, and then the idea was they were trying to use them to, arouse more interest in the case. Would that be accurate?
Dan, that's absolutely spot on. In fact, the name Jack the Ripper was actually created by an enterprising journalist, not the murderer
Mm,
at all. So that was the whole thing. The Dear Boss letter, written on the 25th of September 1888, delivered to the Central News Agency and released on the 27th of September. Then the double event on the 29th. That letter was written in Reading, perfectly written, perfect handwriting, and it was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." And with that, that name stuck. Now, if that letter was never written, the murderer would have been known as Leather Apron.
right. I thought that was another name that was used to describe the killer.
Here on it
Why?
was, yeah.
Why that name? Leather
Leather Apron.
apron.
There was like a sadistic bully, is the best way to put it, called John Pizer, who lived in Mulberry Street. Would you believe 3 minutes from where Kosminski lived?
Hmm.
And he used to bully these women. There were these things called high rip gangs back in those days, where they would try and get any possessions off the women as they earned them. So it was really cruel existence for these men, and Pizer was known to be one of them. And his nickname was Leather Apron.
Hmm.
Interesting enough, he had by the way, he had an eyewitness. It was a policeman that was actually standing with him on the night of the second murder. That basically gave him an alibi, so he definitely wasn't the Ripper. Yeah. But the name Leather Apron stuck, and then on the discovery of Annie Chapman, which is the second murder victim, in the backyard of 29 Hanby Street, a piece of leather apron was discovered. It was not with the murders; it was just there, and that sort of stuck. They needed a name, so they gave them that one.
Was there also? I'm thinking back to the movie uh, with Johnny Depp, which may or may not have been accurate. What was up? There also some graffiti written on the walls of one of the buildings.
There was, Dan, yes, indeed, and that was about 3 o'clock. So after the double event, after Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride's bodies were discovered, a police officer from A Division was walking along Gulston Street, which is actually, I would say, an 8 minute 8 minutes from the murder scene of Catherine Eddowes from Mitre Square. And on the wall was "The Jews," spelled Jews, "are the men who will not be blamed for nothing." And underneath on the floor was a piece of bloodied apron from Catherine Eddowes.
Hmm. So, what's the interpretation of that? Also, that
Now that's
graffiti.
very, and I do have the interpretation of that, and I have an announcement very shortly, which I can't give yet,
That's
um,
okay,
where I've actually given the answer to the what that actually means.
but it does have some meaning.
It has significant meaning, yeah.
Okay.
It's and the thing is, it's always been contested. It's always been mulled over. Um, I don't like to be called a ripperologist, even though I know the ins and outs of all of this of the case. I've done all the primary research, but this one piece of evidence was significant, and it was washed off the wall
Hmm.
under the Chief Commissioner Charles Warren's instructions, because it was saying it's anti-Semitic, and that area itself, again, a very strong, a very big Jewish community, and there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism at the time, and he thought that would, incite a riot. So that's why he had it. That's his reasoning for why it was washed off. I happen to know the real reason, which again will be in the announcement that I'll be making.
Sounds like that might have been a mistake to have washed that off the wall.
It cost him his job, so
Hmm.
5 weeks he had to resign.
Yeah, that does sound like a mistake.
It
So,
was.
who then became suspects? Who were some of the immediate suspects in the
There were only,
case?
that there were only ever three. Um, I, I always know that there's 161 so-called suspects.
Really?
That's yeah, that's people making these stories up, and it very much is. Let's dip your hand into a hat, pull out a name. Let's make him Jack the Ripper. Documentary companies do it all the time. The only three real suspects were Michael Ostrog, who was 51, mentally ill. He wasn't even in the area at the time. Excuse me a minute. He wasn't even in the area at the time, but he was named as a suspect from the McNaughton Memorandum written in 1891. Sir Melville McNaughton wrote this, who the three suspects were. So one was Michael Ostrog. The other one was Montague John Druitt, who was discovered in December 1888. He drowned with stones in his pockets, and it was thought that he committed suicide. But considering what he actually did, he was playing cricket in Blackheath the day after one of the murders, which is very, unrealistic. Now, he had a very sad career and a very sad life. He was sacked he was a barrister in Minories, which isn't too far away from the murders, but he had been sacked from an all boys school under dubious circumstances. So that's the best way we can put it. And so we don't even know how can I put this without causing too much contention? His sexuality, his sexual orientation.
Okay.
So that leaves us the only other one, which is sort of very, how can I put this? Telegraphed is the best way I can say it. So we're never given his first name. We're just given the name Kuzminski. We're given a Polish Jew is what we're given. Strong homicidal tendencies, and the evidence that they had was he was the main suspect.
When you say he had homicidal tendencies, what do you mean by that? And how did they know that?
They knew because by then they knew who he was. They knew that he was the Ripper by 1891.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a theory that I read a little bit about that's floating around this whole Ripper universe, that H.H. Holmes, who was a serial killer in the United States, actually went to Great Britain and became the Ripper. What's your comment about that?
Balderdash.
Okay.
Do you know what? I so love this one. This is like trying to fit a hexagonal piece of into a round hole, not a square into a round hole. It's hexagonal peg into a round hole. He was never the Ripper. I was asked, I was approached by his descendant, Mudgett, I think his name is, and we knew who he was. We knew who the Ripper was, and there's absolutely no way that H.H. Holmes could have ever been Jack the Ripper, ever.
Because I think
Buffalo Bill was in
that claim was made by one of his relatives, if I remember.
Right. Yeah. It's just to say someone's in London at the time and say, right, he's Jack the Ripper, would be laughed out of a court of law. Mm-hmm. This is the thing. This is when you look at the actual suspects. I can't even use that word. So-called suspects. The guy that found, one I get all the time is a guy called Charles Lechmere. So his name was actually Charles, well, he was called Charles Cross at the time, and witnesses were given different names. So the witness that discovered Annie Chapman was given a different name. Now, if I was the Ripper and I'd just done what I did to Polly Nichols, I certainly wouldn't have hung around. I certainly wouldn't have gone to work. I certainly wouldn't have gone and found a policeman to tell them that there was a body found. I certainly wouldn't. I would have, there's just no way. So they're just ridiculous. They just get more contrived and preposterous as they go along. There are only ever three suspects. One of those suspects wasn't even in the country. One of them was, and they tried to sort of dilute who he was. But by the time the McNaughton Memorandum was written, they knew who the Ripper was.
let's see, I was thinking about the so I'm thinking about the evidence of these cases. One of the problems with the Zodiac murders is, and it was a function of the ineptitude of the police officers who investigated the case, was also a function of the time that they didn't have anything like DNA evidence. So I'm guessing that that's true with the Ripper because the DNA evidence that they have now in crime scenes, that's been around just very recently. So well, how could they use anything from the victims to tie the killer to the case that might
They
involve DNA?
so interesting question because back then the only way they would have cut that they would have found the murderer was if the murderer had confessed or was caught at the crime scene. That's
Right.
it. That's the only way they would have caught him. And say confessions back then they were still torturing, but they didn't do that. I'm sort of keeping away from the Zodiac because I do have I've put a lot of time into that one. With the Ripper, um, the crime scenes were washed down. The clothes, all the evidence were burned,
Hmm.
and people just got on with their lives. Fingerprinting was very in its very early days. So was criminal profiling. One of the first criminal profiles done by Dr. Thomas Bond was of the Ripper.
Hmm.
And when you actually read the criminal profile, it's as if he knew who the murderer was and he wrote the the profile from who he knew the murderer was. It's quite a bizarre thing to read. I would say bizarre. It's an interesting thing to read. And again, the crime scene photography like this was very much in its infancy. So we're very, very lucky to get the the mortuary photos of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. But on the fifth victim, Mary Jane Kelly, they took the picture of her in situ. That's what he did. That's how
Hmm.
she was found. That's how she was left. Outside of that, they had no chance, to be fair to the police, and they did really do the best that they could. If we come to the mid-70s with Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, the police did the best that they could at the time, even though they made huge mistakes. From that case, the Yorkshire Ripper case became the Police National Computer, which then was like the founder of all of the database of evidence to
Yeah,
where
like
we've
the
got.
FBI
Yeah, yeah,
database in the United States.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So now we're at a stage now where if the murderer committed those Ripper murders back then, with what we have today, what there is today, he wouldn't have got away with it.
So, who, in your opinion, who was the Jack the Ripper?
Well, it's not an opinion because really we've done it through scientific fact
Okay.
and the research of the case, which I'll go through with you.
Yeah.
So, the night of the murder of Catherine Eddowes, there was also in Mitre Square the houses as well, and they were used as police lookout houses for Fenian interests. Because as I told you that when the Irish bombed Scotland Yard in 1884, some of the bombs that they used were found in one of the houses in Mitre Square, very
Oh.
close to the docks. So there was acting sergeants or sergeants were the only people allowed to do this Fenian work. And again, how can I put this? If I say that the Ripper case was a blip in a very big case of Fenian fear, that
Hmm.
all included in the Ripper case are also in the Finian case,
Hmm.
um, and they had to bump out to do this to do the Ripper work. They had to. They were with a very big threat by the Irish to the British, believe it or not, back then, especially Queen Victoria. So the acting sergeant called Amos Simpson, who was on duty, and thankfully I found the what I need for that now. He came along and found the body of Catherine Eddowes before PC Watkins. When they took the body away, he asked the shawl that was at the murder scene, he said, "Could I take that?" And again, they didn't really know too much about evidence, so he was allowed to have it, hence its existence. So this thing about people saying, "Well, where did you get the shawl?" Well, I didn't create the shawl. The shawl has been there, and through generations of families descended from the acting sergeant Amos Simpson. So that's how we got the evidence. When I bought the shawl in 2007 in the March, I bought it for one significant thing, and that was the Michaelmas pattern of Michaelmas daisies on the shawl. And Michaelmas is an Eastern Orthodox Christian celebration and Western Christian celebration, celebrated on two specific dates of the year, 29th of September and the 8th of November. And lo and behold, those are the dates that the Ripper went out and murdered 3 of his 5 victims.
Mm.
So why was the shawl left at the murder scene? Consider it's very expensive, because that's his way of letting everybody know the date of the next murder. And it was. So the 8th of November, when he went out and he murdered Mary Jane Kelly in the early hours of the 9th, the morning of the 9th, if you like. So technically it's the 9th, but it's the night of the 8th. So that's really where my story started. Now, I knew that the shawl had been in Scotland Yard's Crime Museum all through the 90s. So I called the curator, a guy called Alan McCormick, who told me that was the first bit of new information that he's heard in decades.
Wow.
He said, I don't know why they do these documentaries. I don't know why they write these books, make these films. Scotland Yard have always known the identity of Jack the Ripper, and it was Aaron Kosminski. And just like that.
Now, who was this person?
Aaron Kosminski,
yeah,
he was a Polish immigrant Jew that came over in 1881 with his brother Wolf. He was 23 at the time of the murders. He suffered from schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, solitary vices, which meant public masturbation, so which is very typical of common for schizophrenics to do. Remember, I'm a therapist. And there's a lot of story that I can't say because it's coming out in the announcement that I'll be making shortly. Yeah. What had happened was that after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, he did try and kill his own sister with a knife. The family knew it was him. They gave him up to the police, and he was taken down to a police seaside home in Hove called Clarendon Villas, where he was confronted with the only eyewitness that saw him attack Elizabeth Stride, which is all of what I'm telling you now is what Scotland Yard told me.
Mm-hmm.
And the eyewitness, a guy called Israel Swartz, gave an unhesitating ID that that was the man he saw attacking Elizabeth Stride minutes before her body was discovered by Louis Deemschutz. Now, if we take the front door of Aaron Kosminski and the front door of Duffield Yard in Berners Street, it's 500 yards. Just literally the other end of his road. And he had to go out and murder that night because of this Michaelmas connection, which was significant to him. So what the police did is they had the man, but they couldn't formally arrest him because the confrontation was considered a weak ID. So they had the man, but they couldn't literally prosecute him. So they put him under watch by 2 safety officers. It's also written that the Ripper knew he was caught. It's also written that he was named by Donald Swanson. It's also written by the head of the CID, the head of the case, that the Ripper was always known, that it wasn't a mystery, that they knew who it was. And if Robert Anderson had named the Ripper back in 1910 in his memoirs, we wouldn't be here today. But he didn't. It was Donald Swanson who named Kosminski was the suspect. So what they did is they put him in Stepney Workhouse. They then put him into Colney Hatch, where they let it all calm down for a few years. Then in April 1894, they moved him to Leavesden Asylum. Then his case records, so after all his case records, obviously, they disappeared for 20 years. So there's nothing about that man for 20 years. And then towards the latter part of his life, in 1919, there's some case notes. And it's basically the deterioration of him in Leavesden Asylum. And he died on March the 24th, 1919.
Wow.
Yeah, so sorry about that. Always
Yeah.
get a bit more about this point. Can you just bear with me a second? I'll
Yeah,
just see if
sure.
I'm just going to put you to the ceiling. So, I'm back. There you go.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Just I've had a bad bout of asthma just recently, so I'm just getting over that.
Okay. So I would guess in some respects you're not a very popular person in the Ripper community for coming
No.
out and naming the Ripper.
Well, you know, I have no interest in in the ripperology world. I have no interest in discussing the minutiae of the could be's, would be's, whatever's. I'm not interested. I've always been open with what I've got, and people just hate the fact. In fact, what it is, they just refuse to believe. So when my book came out, we had a caused a huge furore in this community, and so we had to go one step above, which we did, and it's taken 10 years. But I can tell you this: I'm not interested in a ripperologist who perpetuates a myth.
Hmm.
I'm not interested in a tour guide who just makes up a story for public information that's inaccurate. What I'm
Is that
interested,
what you find on those Ripper
oh,
tours in
yeah,
London? Yeah.
absolutely. The nonsense that I hear when I'm walking through makes me laugh. When I do a tour, you get the full story, you get the truth, and you get who it was and how we proved who it was. And my aim is for uh, information, but the truth, not this. Who is Jack the Ripper? Jack the Ripper's been known for over 114 years now. In fact, he was known for since 1889, March 89. So it was 135 years. He's always been known. So there's big money making industry in this,
Sounds like it.
of which I don't. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is stop this perpetuation of the myth. Let the real truth be told, and let these poor victims be put to rest once and for all, and stop glorifying this serial killer that doesn't deserve it. So really, that's really my message.
Well, that sounds like kind of a laudable message. Um, so you wrote a book. What's the name of your book about this? And where can people get it?
Okay, so the book's naming Jack the Ripper. It's At the time it was the 14-year journey of how we solved who the Ripper was conclusively. You can get it from www.thejackthерippertour.co.uk.
Okay.
It's always available. Got some really. I've just had a very beautiful set of books printed, so they're all in colour. I did that as a special a gift to me by the publisher. Um, I do tours again on the same website. You can find me on Facebook on the Jack the Ripper Experience or Russell Stephen Edwards, where I literally highlight all of the area. And people come at me, Jack the Ripper Experience. Well, that's unpleasant. Well, actually, if you looked at what I do and how I do it, um, people really actually understand what I'm trying to achieve there.
Would you restate the website again?
Of course, it's www.thejackthерippertour.co.uk.
Okay. All right. Oh, well, that's interesting. I guess I didn't necessarily expect to have this be the result of this conversation, that there would be an identified, you know, person who committed all this.
Yeah,
And I can understand why it's, well, I think what you're saying, it's lucrative, monetarily lucrative to keep perpetuating this myth. So
yeah.
I can understand the rationale behind that. So let's jump, if we can. Anything else you want to say about the Ripper murders that we
Um,
haven't talked about?
Watch this space. There'll be a big announcement later in the year.
Okay. So let's go to the Zodiac
Yeah.
murders, since you seem to be familiar with that. What are the comparisons you see with the Zodiac murders, comparing the
Inter-
Ripper to?
interesting because there was a victim. There's a Martha Tabram victim that's very interesting to me. Riverside is where I think he lived, which is I don't know if you're aware that if you actually got in a car and drove from well, I said the five medicines. There isn't five medicines, is there? There's Lake Berryessa, there's San
Hmm.
Francisco, where Paul Stein was shot, and then
Hmm.
there's that driveway, that little tiny little driveway, isn't there, where the first two victims were murdered. It was over a short period of time. It was more like a rage killing, very much like the Rippers murders. And when you look at the MO, again, he shot one of the victims, he stabbed the others,
Stabbed, yeah.
and shot the first. So the first attack, he used a gun. The second attack at Lake Berryessa, he used a knife. Then he used the gun for Paul Stein. And it's interesting that even though you think, because of course, I love San Francisco, by the way. What a beautiful place to be in California. That when you actually drive, you drive from the first murder, and you can do it in a big loop. It's less than 2 hour drive. I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't.
So what I learned about trying to not try, what I learned about investigation is take it all away. Winthrop, it's called Winthropping. Do what you would. How would you do it? Forget what you're given. How would you commit these murders?
Hmm.
So you've got to get. So number one is he's got to put petrol in a car to get over to Somerset. He's got to literally. So service stations. So I would have gone to the service stations, got identification of the night before and the day before, a couple of days before, of all the people that would have been through there. I had to see if there's a fit.
Hmm.
What, as you well know, this was all done on fingerprints, not fingerprints, handwriting, wasn't it? It's all done on handwriting, which never matched. It's never matched the letters. And this thing about when you talk about Arthur Lee Allen being ambidextrous, that is a very interesting thing as well. But the thing is, the same amount of victims as the Zodiac is the same as the Ripper.
Hmm.
Couples and a singular man, and a singular man. Paul Stein was murdered. Really, I don't know how much you know. I've not seen the interview from you other gentlemen, but Paul Stein was used as an example to prove that this man was prepared to kill. I don't know if you're aware of that, because that very much is not the MO of the Zodiac.
No, I don't know that I knew that.
So that this is little bits of nuggets of information that I can give you. The other thing is you're looking at a big lumbering man. And if you look at the interviews with the police at the time, where they thought it was a man of color.
Hmm.
So the police did not pick up a man walking away from the murder scene, and he
Right.
disappeared on the Presidio. I'm sure you're aware that that's where he disappeared, which is
Yeah.
like a big arc, isn't it?
Hmm.
They did. So one of the investigation officers did stop a man, a big lumbering man, but they let him go.
Because he
Didn't,
wasn't African American.
and he wasn't African American. No, of course,
Yeah.
no. Riverside is where I believe he was based, where he lived. Um, and this is the thing about when you look at investigations like this, you look at the facts and then you say, like, I've got that. I know the primary information, right? How would I do that? I would need a gun. I would need opportunity. I would need an escape route. I would need to know how I'm going to get away. Because if you look more than Lake Berryessa rather than the car park, that's a courting couples place. That's very exposed. He wore a suit. He wore his Zodiac suit, the very
Right. The
scary,
hood.
yeah, the very imposing, dare I say, the sort of Ku Klux Klan type of,
Hmm.
the scary, that, intimidating outfit that hides your identity from who you are. You know, many people could have been there on that day, and could have many eyewitnesses. If you go back to, sorry to digress, if you go back to Ted Bundy,
Yeah.
when the
Ted.
summer when there were people sunbathing, how close he was to be getting, the risk he took to take a girl from that beach where he did at that time is very, very high. So again, with the Ripper, very high risk of being caught. How do I do that to eliminate the risk as much as I can? You know,
Mm.
did he go out and murder these women, these people at that time? Well, I would say that the first murders, more opportunity. I think he was known to the first victim. I think her and her husband ran a restaurant, didn't they? I don't give any
Right.
names out. And so she wasn't a loose woman, but she saw other men.
Hmm.
And whether he was a hitman for the husband, we'll never know. But we
Mm.
know that there was something going on there. And the fact is, if you know the road, it is one main road, and it's like a little lay-by, isn't it? Just on the right as the road bends, and it was used as a lover's lane. The opportunity again, just driving along. Were they victims or were they chosen? Same with the Ripper victims. Were they victims? Were they chosen? Opportunity. Was it planned out? I think this guy was not just he did not just go out and arbitrarily just murder people. He had a plan, as the Ripper did. And as I say, Paul Stein was more to prove that he could murder at will for another reason, which when we get to it, because we're in discussions right now with a TV company,
Mm.
that
So
that's why.
you're pretty convinced that the Zodiac was Arthur Lee Allen?
No,
No.
no, that's the other mistake.
Oh.
Um, don't just take the name and believe that's him. Question every single thing about this person. Arthur Lee Allen's handwriting doesn't match the Zodiac's whatsoever. Are you
Oh.
aware of that?
No, I'm
Not at
not.
all. No, it doesn't match at all. The curious thing is, and it's not Ted Bundy, by the way. It's interesting enough that there was another victim 2 years before the Zodiac murders. She drove a Volkswagen Beetle. There was lots of evidence there. There was
Was this the
sweatiness on it.
one at the community college?
That's the one, Sherry Joe Bates. Yeah,
Yeah,
very
Sherry Joe
horrible
Bates.
murder. And again, not in the MO of the Zodiac. Even though he did go to her college and did scrawl on the desk, and that handwriting did match the Zodiac's. So I do believe that Riverside was where he was based.
Hmm. Wow. Well, Russell, I think, just my opinion, I think maybe you should give up your business and become a full-time investigator solving some of these
If someone would
crimes.
pay me, if someone would pay me, I'd do it tomorrow.
Hmm.
I do.
Because
I've solved another one. Very, very, again, very contentious, but it's not over yet. We're waiting for the end results of that before I definitely. It's funny, you know what? All these years of what I've been able to do with my life, it feels like this is a gift and very much a calling of what I
hmm,
can do.
yeah,
You know, I'm very happy to just walk away. Well, I would say walk away. Um, I'm very much involved in the Ripper world with what I do, which sometimes puts a strain on my family life and my
I bet
family.
it does.
But it's very supportive, exceptionally supportive.
Yeah,
Um, I thoroughly love what I do. If somebody comes along to me and says, Russ, you know what, we want to pay you to go and solve these murders because obviously you can do it over and above what other people can do, then I would consider that very strongly.
well, it sounds like just from this conversation, you have some gifts in that area, and people are still being murdered, even
Yeah.
with DNA evidence and a lot of other modern techniques. You could be helpful in solving some of those crimes.
Yeah, well, again, behavioral profiles. I studied therapy. So it took 5 years to become a qualified therapist. So being able to put your head into the head of a murderer is quite something. It's not an easy thing to do, but if you can do it, which I can now, um, it's working out how you would do it and
Yeah,
spotting the obvious. And it's the obvious
mm,
that's overlooked,
I
and that's
bet it
something.
is. I bet it
And that's
is.
what yeah,
Well,
yeah.
well, I want to thank you for taking time to have this conversation with me today. You've given me a lot of insights. I think I'll try to go find your book and read that book. And just once again, thank you for spending time and maybe we can have you back again talking about some other serial killers. That'd be
I'll tell you
okay?
what, Dan, there'll be something coming out in the autumn.
Okay,
Look me up then.
okay, I will. Russell, thank you very much. Have a
Thank you
good
for your
day.
time.
Yeah,
You too.
thank
Thanks,
you.
Dan. Bye.